Howdy y'all, and welcome to another installment of Farmer's Fight. On this episode, we zoom the camera back a bit and take a look at middling farmers, commonly known as the yeomanry. This class of people will come to constitute one of the largest, if not the largest, constituencies within the agrarian revolt. So obviously, we should take the time to get an idea of just who they were, which is not always clear-cut. Like most historical events and actors, nuances, outright differences, and multiple historical interpretations make drawing a singular conclusion kind of difficult. But fear not, I'm going to give it the old college try here. When I started this research, I understood the yeoman to be a small landholder who was largely self-sufficient and operated independent of the marketplace. This view is mostly true, but other factors such as regional, economic, and cultural differences create a more complex picture. That is why I'm breaking this topic into 2 episodes. Today's show, which is 5A, is a general introduction to the yeoman figure. Next show, 5B, you can see the creativity there, will cover the southern yeomanry in more specificity. Think historiography. As always, you can check out the sources I've used for this episode. Just head over to farmersfightpodcast.com and click on the link for this show. Okay, you ready? Let's do it. Episode 5A, an introduction to the American yeoman. At the start of the 19th century, Americans were still largely living in forest and on the edge of the Appalachian mountain range. Cultural mores, such as thrift and religious observance, were often brought over from the homelands of many frontier settlers, and further shaped by the subsistence lifestyle and general hardscrabble conditions found on the American frontier. It was here, and in later frontier settings of the West, that the American ideal of the yeoman farmer reigned supreme. In the early history of what would become the United States, a diverse cast of European peoples flocked to the eastern seaboard of North America for a multitude of reasons. Some sought religious and political freedom. Some came for economic opportunity. And others were social misfits who sought nothing more than a divorce from oppressive European society. In 1860, around 88 to 85% of the population traced its ancestry back to either Britain, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, France, the Netherlands, Sweden, Finland, Germany, and some other European nations. Despite the linguistic, religious, and general cultural differences of these European settlers, a unifying factor was the widespread agrarian bent of the new nation and the general desire to improve one's personal and familial circumstances. For the majority of the country's history, approximately 3/4 of Americans did not own black slaves. Of the quarter that did, the majority held 9 or fewer. Those owning 10 to 100 slaves made up about 6% of the population. The 0.1% who owned 100 or more slaves constituted the large plantations of the South. As an example, in 1770 Virginia, more than half of the colony's land was owned by just 10% of white plantation owners, each with hundreds of slaves. Overall, the concentration and disparity of slave ownership in the country mirrored the general stratification of class structure in most European societies in regards to economic and social power. Those whose wealth fell somewhere between the elite and the pauper were either urban artisans or some sort of small land-owning farmer. These middling farmers came to be known as yeomen, which is an English term that refers to a person whose status was somewhere between the gentry and a laborer. These men typically operated independent of commercial markets and worked the land with the help of their families rather than slaves. These farmers were often self-sufficient by necessity and middle class when compared to the planter elite or landless class of poor whites. In the Revolutionary period, the sort of family farmer characterized by the yeoman made up the majority of white farmers in the colonies. These men would come to play a key role in the American Revolution, as well as post-revolutionary state governments. The values they embodied, those of honesty, hard work, and independence, were seen as the ideal model for the new American citizenry. The yeoman, or more accurately the family farm, was vital to the Republican concept of government as a public creation of a sovereign and independent people. Thus, the yeoman was the ideal citizen, as they often owned their own property and did not exploit a large number of laborers. Due to these traits, early American statesmen such as Thomas Jefferson saw the small and independent farmer as the height of moral virtue and Protestant work ethic. For Jefferson, a man born to the upper crust of colonial society, the yeomanry was something the elite could never be, a dependable and honest people that were the very embodiment of agrarian values and republican government. He saw the yeoman as something set apart from the urban and European masses, people he described as swinish. In a letter to the Marquis de Lafayette, Jefferson said that the American yeomanry were not the same sort of peasants or proletariat worker found in Europe. They were something far better, industrious and self-sufficient, but earnest in their dedication to rural values and the equality of producers. Despite this consensus on some basic facts, the question of who really were the yeomen has been asked by academic historians several times over. Because that's just kind of what they do. Gotta make a name for yourself somehow. But to be fair, interpretations depend on where and when one is looking, as the yeoman did differ by region and did not exist in a historical vacuum. For our purposes, we are mainly interested in the South's yeomanry. But in order to do that topic some justice, I think we should put off the discussion until next episode. So, for the remainder of this installment, we should take a look at historian Richard Hofstadter's analysis of the yeoman figure in general. In his 1956 book, Age of Reform, the Hoff attempted to set the record straight in regard to what he saw as the mythos of the American yeoman. Hofstadter asserts that the yeoman was not the patron saint of Arcadian America, but instead, quote, a harassed little country businessman who worked very hard, moved all too often, gambled with his land, and made his way alone. To the Hoff, as I like to call him, the yeoman's lifeways could better be explained by a desire for wealth accumulation and social mobility, as opposed to the mythos which frames the yeoman as an ardent disciple of tradition. Though they may have initially began as pioneers living in log cabins and working daily to overcome hardships, the purpose of the yeoman's frugality, according to the Hoff, was to achieve commercial success on par with that of the large planters in the South and cattlemen in the border states. The cost savings attained through this frugality and the yeoman's independence from the marketplace was put towards investments in livestock, buying more acreage and better tools, improving existing buildings, and just about anything that would aid in generating greater profits. Historical documents report that farmers also worked off of their farms when possible to increase their cash savings. The desire to make as much money as possible with what one had was perhaps a better explanation for values like thrift and a sort of craftsman-like ingenuity, which I read to mean a general do-it-yourself mentality. According to Hoff, the average yeoman was not some sort of economic hermit, but rather sought to enter the marketplace just on his own terms. Unlike the contemporary bohemian immigrants who view the purpose of agrarian life in traditionalist and familial terms, the American farmer possessed an inward-directed psychology and was a petty capitalist in his political views. In regards to civic politics, the yeoman was motivated by personal interests and sought to increase profits by improving transportation for their product. Hofstadter's take on the yeoman as a country bourgeois figure is likely steeped in his own personal biases against the conservative and agrarian traditions in America. Despite being a celebrated Americanist, Hofstadter was a reformed Marxist whose own progressive political leanings came under fire during the age of McCarthy. As I mentioned in episode 2, His work on the American populist and to some degree the agrarian tradition as a whole were colored by his own cosmopolitan principles and his contempt for the McCarthyite conservatism of the 1950s. Nevertheless, Hofstadter backs up his assertions about the agrarian mythos with some facts regarding the evolution of the yeomanry. The Hoff reminds us that commercial agriculture was major business in the early colonies and only grew in prominence after the Civil War. The first commercial tobacco crop was planted in 1612. From there, American plantation agriculture was spurred by global demand for other cash crops like cotton and rice. But the majority of American farmers at the time practiced the kind of subsistence agriculture associated with the idealized yeomanry. Between 1850 and 1860, changes in the American economy forced many yeomen to adapt to new economic and social realities. The rise in commercial enterprise and domestic industry, coupled with large-scale globalized trade and demand from abroad, facilitated the rise of commercial agriculture, mainly in the form of cotton and later foodstuffs. Soon, the yeoman wasn't producing what he needed, but rather focusing on raising cash crops and turning a profit. As the Hoff saw it, the small landed yeoman of early America was largely gone. In his place was that harassed and hurried little businessman. As American society transformed from a predominantly subsistence agrarian culture to a modern industrial one, many began to cling to the ideals of, quote, non-commercial agrarian values. Here we find a bit of irony, as Hofstadter asserts that the shift from a traditional expectation of economic opportunity, meaning subsistence with limited surplus, was made possible by the popular egalitarianism embodied in Jacksonian democracy. Hofstadter saw the pro-democratic spirit that sought empowerment of the common man as responsible for unleashing a zeal for profits and social advancement, which further degraded traditional agrarian values. Increasing land values in the early 19th century tempted the individual yeoman to invest all he could save into uncultivated land. The thirst for greater profits and the reality of how those were achieved in a commercialized and speculative economy demanded that the yeoman suppress tradition and his Protestant morals. If the prevailing Calvinist social atmosphere of rural life implied that hard work was rewarded with material gains, then gambling with real estate required that the yeoman turn a blind eye. With ever-increasing returns, many of which were on par with riskier investments, the humble and frugal farmer quickly became a land speculator. Land was purchased, cleared, and sometimes improved by the American yeoman, and quickly sold to Bohemian immigrants, namely the Germans and Swedes. Those people came from cultures that held deep-seated agrarian virtue and thus did not lust to be self-made men like the Americans, but rather sought to provide a legacy for their children. But to be clear, the transformation of the self-sufficient frontier farmer to that of a speculative agriculturalist was an uneven experience for America's yeomanry. The rate of these changes depended on region, but tended to take place in the Northeast faster than anywhere else. By 1830, Ohio had undergone the shift from subsistence to commercial farming, with Illinois, Indiana, and Michigan making the change by 1850. Some farmers in these areas even became employers of itinerant farm laborers. Hofstadter tells us that farmers eventually came to depend more on the market for purchasing supplies and even took out cash loans or rented the implements they needed to produce the crop. Thus, the shift from subsistence to a relentless drive for profits had three major consequences. It changed the yeoman's traditional relationship with the land and created little attachment to locality. It undermined the village communal spirit that they were lauded for, and transformed the farmer into a cog in the commercial industrial economy rather than someone who stood outside of it. I will spare you my treatise on the effects of industrial society on the human person, and just end Hofstadter's analysis with a quote from one Western farmer, who in 1868 said, The old rule that a farmer should produce all that he required and that the surplus represent his gains is part of the past. Agriculture, like all other business, is better for its subdivision, each on growing that which is best suited to his soil, skill, climate, and market, and with his proceeds purchasing his other needs. While Hofstadter's analysis is helpful in that it gives us an idea of the complexities surrounding the general figure, it doesn't much sound like the yeoman of the South, who seemed to be far from the entrepreneurial land speculator described in his book. It is certainly true that the encroaching forces of finance and industry changed the American economy, and with it the modes and lifeways of the traditional yeoman. But this seems to be a phenomena isolated to the North and Western United States, at least in the pre-war years. This is primarily due again to a major linchpin of the Civil War, the economic and cultural differences created by the South's system of chattel slavery. The South's yeoman will eventually succumb to the forces of globalized trade and industrialization in the aftermath of the war, but that was what the Agrarian Revolt was really all about, so we should probably end this episode right here. Next time, we will continue our discussion of the yeoman, but turn our attention to the South and the people who would take up the standard of revolt in the late 1870s and 1880s. Until next time, this is Farmer's Fight.